It's been almost 2 years since the beginning of the Ukraine-Russian conflict. What will happen next year? What will happen in 2024? At least by the end of this year, it seems that U.S. support for Ukraine, at least politically, domestically within the U.S., there are now some diverse opinions. There's a real divergence in opinion. I think chances of significant continued financial and military support for Ukraine from the U.S. is going to be limited. Now, of course, EU also, there are very divergent views now on whether or not Ukraine should be continued to be supported the way it has been. The economies of EU are not doing well. We've seen the latest numbers. Germany has been in negative growth for several quarters now. France PMI started falling again for months now throughout the fall. So I think when the two major engines of economy in the EU are in this pretty difficult position, support by the populace to Ukraine to continue to provide weapons and money to Ukraine is going to be lessened. What has happened in the last 2 years throughout the conflict? A number of significant events have occurred. The Palestine-Israel conflict has occurred, which is going to drain resources from the U.S. significantly. And it looks like there are other issues coming up. The Houthis in Yemen are now starting a blockade of the Red Sea, which is very, very significant in terms of the global supply chain and the supply of energy for Europe. I think all of this will have further impact on the European economy. It's going to not all go well for the Europeans in the coming months. And it would also detract the U.S. from continued support of Ukraine. As far as the Russians are concerned, the Russian economy has recovered quite well and has in fact started growing. It has a very strong industrial base, so the military side is not a drain. They can continue to produce. Unlike the U.S., stockpile of weapons and ammunition has already dwindled, given the length of the time required, the amount required to support Ukraine over the course of the last 2 years. So I think there will be some issues, not only in terms of monetary or financial support, but also support of the hardware from the U.S. But on the Russian side, the support in terms of the effort by their industrial base on the hardware side has actually been expanding and accelerating. When you had a significant increase in oil prices last year and stayed at a significant level of over $80 a barrel, Russia still continues to do well in terms of exports. So it appears that Russia financially is doing okay. Industrially, it's expanding. So on the Ukrainian side, financially, it's not doing okay. And industrially, it's been pretty much wiped out. So the effort for the U.S. to get Ukraine to start producing themselves weapons and ammunition, I think it's very difficult because it could be easily destroyed by the Russian side, whereas the Russian industrial effort is not impeded and cannot be impeded by the Ukrainian side. Just a little side note, over $100 billion has gone to support the war effort of Ukraine from the U.S. 90% of that was spent in the U.S. to U.S. corporations to buy equipment, buy supplies, to provide to the Ukrainians. So very little real cash has gone to the Ukrainians. And most of the cash requirement in terms of support for refugees and so on, it came from the Europeans. So again, the Europeans suffered significantly in the process, just like the sanctions against Russia had made the Europeans suffer significantly, whereas the allocations of funding by the U.S. Congress to support Ukraine had been spent in the U.S. Even think tanks in the U.S. and European analysts and commentators have now come to the conclusion that there has to be an end to this pretty soon. Otherwise, it will be a complete collapse of Ukraine. I think Ukraine is going to have difficulty lasting much longer than spring and summer of next year. If that's the case, there will be a settlement, and the settlement will be seen as really a victory for Russia. Russia will probably get to keep all the territory that it now occupies. And then it will demand for neutrality for Ukraine and demilitarization of the Ukrainian region. And the peace guarantee or the neutrality guarantee of Ukraine will now probably come from Russia instead of NATO. So that seems to be the way the situation is moving, especially since there are escalations of the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, with the participation now of several other forces. That has potential for further escalation. I think all of this is all tied in together. It might also tie into just pure conjecture, of course, the one-day trip that President Putin made to Saudi Arabia and UAE, followed by a return to Moscow to meet the president of Iran. So these things are happening very quickly, and the geopolitics is all tied together. There has been some Western press calling for Ukraine to continue to hold on until the end of next year. Now, what will happen at the end of next year? U.S. elections. And it's quite interesting because the Republicans are the ones who are now firmly opposed to continued support financially and militarily of Ukraine. And the Democrats, of course, are sticking to Zelensky. I think what you read in the Western press or press in the U.S. today is probably also tied into the elections, because this would certainly be an election issue. But of course, if Ukraine collapses in the spring or the summer of this year, then it will be a different battle between the two parties of who lost Ukraine.